hopefully everyone can hear me now. I was unfortunately on mute. So hi, everyone. I think I have to kind of restart. So welcome to the latest edition of ShaHackNight Remote. My name is Ryan Spencer, and I'm going to be your one and only co-host for this evening. I'm super glad that you can join us. I am super excited to be speaking with Haru Coryne from ProPublica later this evening to discuss the importance of open data for journalists in the context of an investigation ProPublica did into the COVID pandemic response at a senior housing complex in Chicago. So I'm just gonna quickly, one moment. Just wanna quickly go through an agenda. So basically, we've already kind of started. We're gonna go through a quick announcements and then have the presentation start about, let's say 7:15-ish. And then afterwards, there will be a Q&A. So if you have questions, please feel free to put those into the YouTube chat. Remember that the code of conduct still applies, so let's make sure everything's respectful of each other and then also our presenter. And then afterwards, there is going to be a post live stream Zoom call where we can go through some intros, do some community announcements, and of course, the hacking portion of the evening for the breakout groups. And then that should start around 8, and then around 8:20, you can actually go into the breakout groups. So let's start with a few announcements. Okay, so join the ShaHackNight Slack. If you haven't already done so, follow that link. This allows you to stay up to date on any important news or announcements, and of course, all the presentations that occur on Tuesday evenings. And also, you can just introduce yourself, get to know each other a little bit more if you're new to the ShaHackNight remote community. And also, there's going to be some job postings as well. So there's a lot of resources. So if you have not already done so, please join the ShaHackNight Slack channel. And then becoming a ShaHackNight member. So ShaHackNight is a membership-based nonprofit, which means that you can get directly involved with helping the community and also being able to do things like run for the office of board of directors or even vote for changes in policies at ShaHackNight. So if this sounds like something you're interested in doing, please follow that link to look into the membership and apply. It's super easy and simple, and I promise you it'll be worth it. Okay, so these are a few of our upcoming presentations. So we'll have Kim Creighton with the Anti-Racist Economist, and then the following week, we're gonna also discuss from Chicago United for Equity, the People's Budget, and then for election night, no live stream, vote. If you have not already done so, please make sure you're registered to vote. Okay, so ShaHackNight does have a tech and data help desk, so we're always looking for people to not only help out by volunteering, but also if you need help, you can request help by clicking on the bit.ly link on the announcements. And then, so there is a new kind of like a voting election information guide for anyone in Illinois that's been posted on ShaHackNight's website. It's one of our blog posts by one of our fellow board members, Cameron So. So if you or anyone you know needs information on voting, whether that's getting registered or even checking to make sure you are registered to vote, please follow that link. Check out the blog post. It has a lot of helpful information to read through that you may potentially learn something new. Okay, and then fill out your census. I think everyone at this point has done this. I trust that you all have, but if you have not done so, please make sure you fill out your census. We wanna make sure that everyone gets counted. As of now, it looks like the response rates this is from September 26th, so I'm sure these numbers have greatly increased and everyone has done this, but if you have not, please follow that link and do so. And then the post-presentation Zoom call. So I mentioned earlier that there is gonna be a post live stream Zoom where you can do things like introduce yourself, get to know each other a little bit better, and then also do breakout groups. So there is a link for that right here. I'm gonna also be posting it as well in the ShaHackNight remote channel. So please, after this Zoom, feel free to hop into the next one so that way you can actually get to know each other a little bit better and have some chance to actually talk and interact. Okay, so that's all that's all I have. So I guess that's it for announcements. So at this point, we're about ready to start the actual presentation. So we have Haru Coryne with us. Are you there? There
yeah, just getting tuned in. Sorry about that.
I feel you on that. Yeah, so we're going to go ahead and I'm going to turn off my camera. I'm going to mute myself to let you go ahead and start your presentation.
Okay, great. I'm going to share my screen, and if I screw anything up, please tell me so.
Don't worry, we'll let you know.
Okay. All right, all good? I'm going to take that as a yes. No one says anything. Okay, great. Yep. Thanks, Ryan, for the really nice introduction, and also Josh for emceeing and handling all of this. My name is Haru Coryne. I'm a data reporter with ProPublica, formerly known as ProPublica Illinois, but we are now kind of part of the mothership organization now. I'll switch over to my introductory slide. ProPublica is a nonprofit investigative newsroom. We basically do journalism in the public interest through generally kind of like deep dive type stories, often trying to look closely at things like government accountability or corporate malfeasance or what have you. And we're a national organization, but up until recently, I worked at ProPublica Illinois, which was the local shop that focuses just on news in this state. My job there is as a data reporter, which is a kind of specific job that basically means like I'm every other journalist in the newsroom, except that most of what I do is through coding and statistical analysis and things like that. I'm a business reporter by background. I used to work for a trade publication called The Real Deal that covers housing and development, and I've pivoted more to looking at issues related to housing and economic development and things of that nature. Can everybody hear me okay? Am I talking loudly enough or clearly enough?
Yeah, we can hear you just fine.
Okay, great. All right, so the topic of this talk today is a story that ProPublica published back in June that was looking at the way that the coronavirus was affecting people who live in public and subsidized housing complexes for seniors here in Chicago, which was an investigation that we did that heavily relied on open data. And so this is kind of talking through our methodology and our aims there from that lens. And so before we get into the actual story, I thought that I might just kind of define terms a little bit. I know that probably everybody who's tuned into this is familiar with some of the basics of open data, but there might be some people who aren't, so I thought I would just go through it quickly. This is a lot of text on one slide, but I think the essential qualities and takeaways of it is that open data is about access and free use. An open data set is one that where basically anyone can get a hold of the data on their own with very little or no cost, monetarily speaking or otherwise. You don't need maybe special proprietary software in order to use it. It's not something that requires like a Microsoft Access thing or a whatever, some sort of special tool in order to manipulate or interpret. And that once you have it, you could basically do whatever you want with it, including publishing it in its original form or in modified forms. And those are kind of, as far as I understand it, the main tenets of open data. And these are kind of some defining, slightly lengthier traits from the Open Data Handbook that kind of get at some of those questions. Now, open data, I think, broadly refers to all kinds of any kind of data set that has those traits, not necessarily ones that are published by your government, but I'm going to be talking specifically about public open data, but data that is released by municipal and state and county governments. And I think that when it comes to public open data, this is a really nice quotation that kind of sums up what the significance of open data is from a public, when you're talking about a public agency and what that does for civics and good government and journalism. And so I'll just read that aloud. Earlier, such data was often buried in City Hall filing cabinets, provided only after Freedom of Information Act requests, or published electronically, but in cumbersome formats. By contrast, open data in machine-readable formats allows for new applications, analysis, and visualizations to be developed by anyone with basic skills and an internet connection, which I think is kind of what we're all after. Now, to just sort of define this negatively and in the context of journalism, what is not open data? It turns out that a lot of investigative reporting that is driven by data usually doesn't rely on what you might traditionally consider open data. And I'll just give kind of 3 examples of this using stories that ProPublica Illinois has published in the last couple of years. The first one, which some of you are probably very familiar with through previous Shy Hack Night presentations, is the ticket trap, which was a story that we did with WBEZ that was looking at the way that the city uses punitive fines and fees as a revenue source, and that can have disastrous financial consequences for motorists, most of them Black and brown. We also did a story about practices in Illinois public schools where children with disabilities were being locked away in seclusion rooms, often breaking the law. And then we also did a story with the Sun-Times that was looking at video gambling. And each of these were very data-driven stories, but they each kind of exemplified a type of data that is the opposite of open. In all 3 cases, we had to FOIA the data. We or one of our colleagues at a partner newsroom had to put in a public records request. And obviously, if you have to put in a special request for data, it's not really open. I don't know if Matt Chapman is on the call, but he knows a lot about the ticket trap FOIA process. With this case of the quiet rooms, there was an additional hurdle involved where not only did we have to FOIA the data, but once we got the data, it was not even remotely in a machine readable format. In fact, it was just in the form of paper records that we had to manually ingest into a database in order to create something. And then the bad bet was kind of a mix of all these things, including a 3rd dimension of this, which is a data set that was partly, in some way published online in an electronic machine readable format, but it was in a really like wonky, incomplete and partial way that required a lot of manipulation and actually in order to do something useful with it. So all of these are examples of journalism that we've done that's been powered by data, but that did not really rely on open data. But there are exceptions to the rule. And I hope that if David or Josh or Matt are on this presentation, they don't mind me using this, but this is an example of a story that I loved and thought was a great example of investigative journalism that that does rely on open data. This was a story that the Chicago Reporter did earlier in this year following the George Floyd protests that basically fact-checked in a very kind of rigorous watchdog way a claim that the Lightfoot administration had made about the composition of arrests that would have been made at these protests. And they did this, I believe, using the Chicago Open Data Portal set for crimes, or it could have been a separate one for arrests. I'm not sure. I need to double check that. But in any event, it was an open data set that they were able to quickly utilize in order to, again, do an accountability check on a very consequential public statement that our public officials had been making. And it was timely, and it was correct, and it was rigorous. And I don't think that would have been possible in some of these more traditional data journalism type examples I was giving before, where you're not using open data, you're using something that you have to kind of ask for. And to kind of continue along this vein, someone posted on Twitter after this story that basically that the API that had been used to power the open data portal that was behind this story, was shut off afterwards. And I think it was the reporter again that put in a FOIA request for emails about why that API had been shut off. And it turned out that they saw the story internally, the CPD did, and they had a problem with the public having access to it. And this whole saga kind of, I think, really sums up the tension between strong investigative journalism and open data. The same people who may be responsible for publishing and maintaining public open data sets, they may have a vested interest in curtailing its usefulness in the hands of people who are pushing for accountability. Or it could just be that the types of things that you can find lying around on a government website are not necessarily going to lead to novel investigations. And so that's kind of like a give and take. That also leads us to another exception to the open data rule, which is the story that I worked on with Mick Dumke. And Mick Dumke isn't here right now. He had a conflict that came up at the last minute, but he was my reporting partner on this. And this is a story that we did back in June that also relied on an open data set, not from the city, but from Cook County. Now, this story was basically looking at, I already said this earlier, but public CHA owned, like Chicago Housing Authority owned, or privately owned but federally subsidized housing complexes for seniors, where the response to the pandemic was just really kind of disorganized and sometimes chaotic. And as kind of a really heartbreaking consequence of that, there were people who were dying, not necessarily because of the coronavirus, but because of all sorts of things, and in a really kind of undignified manner. Their bodies were not being found quickly enough, and it was a really kind of heartbreaking consequence of this. And we published that in June. And the reason why we reported this story was because a lot of the coverage that we'd been seeing about how seniors were being affected by the coronavirus was focusing on so-called congregate care facilities, so like nursing homes and assisted living centers. But anyone who has like an older relative knows that not all senior citizens live in congregate care centers. A lot of them live independently, but they're still vulnerable to the coronavirus, and not just to the coronavirus, but to the kind of auxiliary collateral problems brought about by the pandemic. It's not just about people who are literally contracting the virus and getting sick and dying, but about people whose networks of care were being disrupted because of social distancing, because the service providers that they relied on were no longer working were no longer physically present, we're no longer going into the office, whatever it might have been. So we really wanted to unpack those two dimensions of this, and we saw that senior housing was kind of a good example of that. And the data set that we ended up using for this was something that maybe some of you are really familiar with, which is the Cook County Medical Examiner Case Archive. This is sort of like a perfect example of an open data set. It's machine readable. It's on a public website. You can download it for free. You can use it without restriction. You can manipulate it however you want. And just as like a point of fact, the medical examiner, sometimes called the coroner, is the office that is responsible for investigating deaths in the county where there is some need to determine how a person died. Not every death gets investigated, but a subset of them do. And obviously this has become a really crucial data set since the pandemic started, because it helps us understand who's dying and why and where, and that kind of thing. Yeah, this is widely used data. Here's just a couple of other examples of news outlets that have delved into it. In fact, in this very same vein, my colleagues Cecilia Reyes and Elvia Malagon at the Tribune did a story also about the same population, also looking at senior housing. And also at the Southside Weekly, there's a great COVID-19 death tracker that is, I think, piped directly from the API related to this data set. So it's widely used, very, very helpful data. In terms of how this story came together and how data played a role in it, I think it's helpful to just sort of lay out the two roles that data usually plays in an investigation. I like to think of it as basically either being top-down or bottom-up. A top-down data story is one that really starts with the data, where you basically have a resource, a Cook County case archive, whatever it might be. And you develop a hypothesis based on the data. If you're someone who has data science skills or statistician type skills, really just some sort of scientific methodological background, and you're able to look at data and analyze it and prepare a theory or a hypothesis that you want to test. That's what starts with the data kind of from like 50,000 feet, and then you you test it out, kind of like with interviews, basically. You do the sort of traditional gumshoe type reporting after you've already done the analysis, because you're guessing that something might be true based on data, but you really want to hear from a human being in order to understand whether that is in fact the case. And so that is kind of what I would describe as like the top-down model. This story was the opposite of that, which was more bottom-up. Basically, we found out that something bad was happening. We tried to find more examples of this happening, identify a data set that would allow us to kind of pinpoint it in a larger context, and then measure the phenomenon. The way that kind of looked like in this story, these are the basic steps of it, is that a tip came in, someone wrote to Mick saying, a number of people had written into Mick saying, that the situation in senior housing buildings was not very good. You know, building staff had been reduced, information was not freely flowing, and people were dying in this kind of heartbreaking way where, you know, their bodies weren't being found and that kind of thing. And we, so, you know, Mick would say that, you know, basically one tip would be something, but once a second tip or a third tip came in, like then you knew you really had the ability to commit resources to investigating this as a story. So that's when Mick came to me as the data reporter and asked for my help in terms of locating this phenomenon in data and understanding it and measuring it a little bit better. And so the step, you know, here are the kind of the steps of that. The things that I'll get into later have to do with using data in conjunction with FOIA, and then also with like traditional reporting, and kind of like doing this feedback loop where you analyze data in order to find records in people, and then the records and people that you find help you produce more well-informed queries that you then feed back into the data, and on and on and on. In terms of the first pass of looking at data, we knew we were looking for something very specific. We were looking for residents of senior buildings that were either owned by the CHA or in the private market, but federally subsidized, who had died at home. That was like the basic thing since March. That was like the phenomenon that we were looking for, and the universe that we were looking for was these buildings. And the buildings that we had were basically the addresses. The universe was basically addresses of these buildings that we knew we wanted to look closely at. And so methodologically, you know, this was just kind of like you clean the addresses and then you do a table join. Like that was the thing. And you count up all the people, you know, or the cases associated with every building. I won't go into the, you know, nitty gritty of that because cleaning data is just its own whole thing. But that was the first pass that we did here. Now the kind of, then when things sort of started to get interesting was that, and this is where we start to get into some of the quirks of open data, is that in order to really start doing a bit more thorough reporting, we needed to learn more about these instances where, according to the Cook County Case Examiner, there were people who were dying in the buildings that we cared about. The problem is that the person's name and contact information was missing from that open data set for valid privacy reasons. And then also certain other really valuable pieces of information, notably the circumstances in which the person's body had been found, were not in there as well. And Mick, from his experience reporting here in Cook County, knew that there's a document that exists in the Cook County Coroner's archives or files that is called an investigative report. And an investigative report is essentially that. It's not the autopsy. It's not something that actually specifies, you know, what the person died of. It's not a medical document. It's almost like a police incident report where you basically just say who went there and what did they find and what time was it and who did they talk to. And that was really kind of the essential bits of the story that we were trying to piece together. This is I know this is kind of ironic that I'm redacting documents in a presentation about open data, but this is an example of a case that I've redacted. And so, right, so what we ended up doing was that once we had done this kind of first pass looking at the data and trying to find examples of these deaths, each row in the data set, which I think I can show you, you could see a case number here. And so we were able to go back to the Cook County Medical Examiner and say, hey, these are some of the deaths that we're curious about. We only have a very incomplete view of them because that's what's in the data. Can you give us the actual investigations report for them? It's not truly open in that sense because we had to pay for each report. So we really had to kind of narrow things down, and we went through a lot of back and forth trying to pick which cases warranted, you know, the risk of spending $50 for a piece of paper. And so that we can get into that later. So once we'd gotten those case reports, they included some really valuable information about who was it that died, what kind of family or relations did they have, who might have been the one who discovered them. We were trying to kind of reconstruct the social networks of these people who almost by definition were a little bit more isolated than normal people, and not normal people, but, you know, more than normal, more socially isolated than normal. And so we also had a bit more information about how they died, and we knew that there were a specific subset of cases that we cared a lot about, which were instances where somebody died and they weren't found for days or even a week later. And so this was kind of the really hard part, like sort of like emotionally and ethically, was reaching out to these people and trying to talk to them about what happened and what they found and that kind of thing. I think there were, this is something that data people always, I think, could use a refresher on. There's just all sorts of ethical concerns that kind of bubble up that you don't really think about when you're doing the kind of crunching of data. These have to do with, just like the ethical concerns of tracking down people who have been recently traumatized by the loss of a loved one or something of that nature. And I think these are actually kind of issues that overlap with some of the privacy concerns that are very relevant in the open data universe. And then this is the iterative kind of process that I was talking about before. So, okay, so we've done this first pass through the data. We've requested some records, paid for them, looked at them, read them. That's led us to some people. We've made some phone calls and talked to some folks. What are we going to do with that now? Well, one of the first things that we did was that we tried to pass it back into the data and create a more precise query and sort of pare things down even more and more. So we knew that this was the type of case that we were looking for, people who had died at home in senior buildings and weren't discovered for days. The public version of the case archive was missing certain crucial details in order to identify that. Normally there might be a flag for whether somebody died at home or at a hospital or something like that. There could be a flag that indicated the condition of the body when it was discovered, if it was a long period of time afterwards. And thankfully, with the incident reports, we were able to kind of, I'm sorry, this is so morbid, and maybe I should have put a trigger warning on this, but we wanted to find people whose bodies had been left undiscovered. And there were aspects of the public data set that correlated closely with the narrative details that we cared a lot about. So a few examples were that these were the oldest people. These were people who had a very generic cause of death listed, which kind of seemed to indicate that, like, there wasn't really it wasn't possible to make a determination at the time that the person died and was discovered, and that there was a very short time gap between like the incident and the date. In other words, that they were declared dead on the scene. And these were attributes that once we actually passed them back into the data set and looked more closely at and then requested more records, we turned up with more cases that were exactly what we were looking for. So yeah, that's just the iterative process again. A final, like, really important piece about this was that we got a lot of help. The Cook County Medical Examiner at this time was being like completely flooded with requests for this data for all sorts of applications, and they had a super professional public information officer who was willing to talk to us about all of the things that we were trying to understand. What does this field mean? I want to do X, Y, and Z with the data. Is that okay? Are there flags in the non-public, internal version of the data that maybe we could try to approximate with the public one? What are the risks of doing that? And also just presenting them with their findings and getting them to kind of talk about that, which was just really critical in order for us to not only do the work, but also to feel good about it when we published it. So these are the kind of takeaways that I would say in terms of the usefulness of open data from a journalism point of view. It can be extremely useful to investigative journalists. It's not always, but it definitely can be. And I would say the attributes to be looking for if you're trying to understand if open data fits your process, whether it's an investigation or an academic paper or something like that. It helps to know what you're looking for. That's that kind of bottom-up process that I was talking about before, where like you're not just harking, you're not just sort of like playing around with data, coming up with things, throwing spaghetti against the wall. Like I'm not positive that open data is always the best thing for that. What is really useful is if you actually have a specific thing that you're looking for, a specific pattern that you're looking for, and you have a feeling that this particular open data set will be a good fit for finding that. Having paper records that correlate with the data is really useful. Obviously, this is more relevant with municipal rather than kind of like big data type stuff. Most municipal data sets are literally paper records that have been ingested somehow. So in most cases, there will be a paper file that corresponds with every row. in the data set. It's not always accessible, but in this case there was. The Cook County coroner had a process for, if you want a case archive, you can buy it here, like put in a request. That kind of thing goes a long way. And then finally, this is not something you can really predict, but maybe it is if you have relationships with people. Having a communicative public information officer who can talk to you about the limitations of the data and workshop ideas with you is just super helpful and important. And a couple of things, I don't know if anyone wants to chime in during like the question and answer session. But there are some questions I'd be curious to hear what people have to say about. Another thing is whether this whole methodology could really be considered like driven by open data when ultimately we had to shell out something like $1,000, or maybe not that much, like $600 or something, for 30 or 40 investigative reports. That is a prohibitively high amount of money that, unless you're a national news organization like ProPublica, you might not be able to afford if you were actually trying to do an investigation about people in your community, let's say, or something of that, or in your building, or something like that. And then another thing is just curious about the privacy concerns. What we basically did was that we circumvented the privacy that was built into the public version of the data set by requesting more records and getting those names and calling those people. I don't think there's anything non-kosher about that from like a journalistic point of view or a public records necessarily point of view. But at the same time, it did raise this question for me of whether like, all right, like the person's name is not in there for a reason. I'm digging a little deeper so I can get that person's name. What are the kind of ethical concerns about that? It's something that I'm thinking about as a journalist, and I would be curious if anybody has any thoughts about that they'd be willing to share. As a last thing, we're hiring. ProPublica is looking for a data reporter and a news apps developer. If you thought this talk was even like remotely interesting, or better yet, if you like were listening to this and are like, that guy doesn't know what he's talking about and I know it a lot better, I encourage you to apply. The data reporter is going to be focusing on our local news division, so focusing here on the Midwest and some of our other regions. The news apps will be more of like a general assignment developer on the national team. But if you have any interest in applying, I encourage you to do that. The contact is there. And if you want to email me later to get that contact information or more information, please do so. And yeah, for whatever reason else, this is my contact info. And that's my talk. So again, thank you for listening. And I'm looking forward to hearing what you all have to say.
Awesome. Thank you. For everyone who just saw me for the first time, I'm Derek. I joined in a little bit late, so I'll help with Q&A. But thanks for that presentation. That was really awesome.
Thanks.
We have some questions. Do you want to take the first one, Ryan?
Sure. So our first question here is, was there anything surprising in your findings? So what has the reception been?
So what was surprising about the findings was, I mean, in a way, we weren't surprised because we had suspected that something was happening, and we tried to measure if it was happening, and we found that it was happening. So in a good way, that was a good way in the sense of the story. It was there were no surprises. In terms of, yeah, I mean, it was a complicated story to report in the sense that like, this isn't necessarily like a data surprise, but it was a kind of learning experience. Was that once you kind of talk to people about what was going on here, people just had very different, varying attitudes, even people who lived in these buildings, about what to make of some of the findings, specifically that people were dying in these buildings, or that there was a kind of like a mishmash of responses to the coronavirus. One thing that I heard in particular that I really took away and took very seriously was, residents of some of these buildings saying like, look, we don't live in nursing homes. We don't live in assisted living facilities. We're independent people, and we accept the risks, and we don't want someone checking in on us every like 5 minutes or something. Don't come in here and tell us that we're living the wrong way, or that, don't come in here sort of spreading panic. And in a way, that's kind of a good example of something that you can learn once you start with a premise that you take from data, and then you actually go to people and you talk to them about it, and they'll tell you something that is kind of a whole left turn of what you were thinking about. And we did end up incorporating that into the story. In terms of the reception and the response, I think this story kind of happened as part of like a wave of activism and organizing that was being done by the Jane Addams Senior Caucus. And I think that they were already well on their way to getting a city council bill passed that would mandate more stringent and more regular wellness checks for seniors in buildings and that sort of thing. I wouldn't take credit for that. I think that campaign was well underway by the time that we published this story. But I would like to think that we had like kind of a little bit of a contribution to that somehow.
Yeah, absolutely. Derek, do you want to take the next one?
Yeah, sure. So in the beginning of your talk, you gave some great examples of reporting that comes from open data versus closed data. And you talked about this a little bit, of sort of like the process for each of them.
Yeah.
Sort of how often do you like check for open data? And do you have any particular like tips or tricks on how you go and source that data from data portals and government websites?
I mean, it's one of the, if I'm like, I mean, as a data reporter, I have a very collaborative role. I'm often teamed up with another sort of traditional reporter who's doing some of the groundwork and talking to people and that kind of thing. And one of the questions that I often get is just like, can we get data for this? And one of the first things that I usually do is just check the open data portal in the jurisdiction that I'm looking at. Some data catalogs are more organized than others, are more searchable than others. I actually think the Cook County one and the Chicago one are pretty good, but I've definitely looked at other ones where it's like, oh my God, like, does this even exist? I have no idea. And there, so in terms of tips, I mean, yeah, just like look first, reach for the low-hanging fruit. Open data is the low-hanging fruit from like a journalism point of view. It takes 30 minutes at the most, if you have a type of thing that you're looking for, to just like poke around the catalog and see what's on there. Be mindful of overlapping jurisdictions. If the thing that you're looking for isn't at the city level, it might be at the county level, it might be at the state level, it might even be at the federal level. Kind of poke around and look for instances where, like, if you're looking for a Chicago thing, plug Chicago into a federal EPA data set or something. That might not necessarily be at the municipal level. So that's one thing I would consider. One thing that I've not done that I wish I were better at was just sort of like developing relationships with open data officers, because I'm sure that if you actually had those relationships, you could just email someone and be like, hey, I'm looking for this, do you have it? And that would also cut out a lot of that time and would help you learn a lot more. So.
Great. Some open data officers have been known to attend these HackNet podcasts, so that's a resource.
So when you were talking about the top-down reporting approach, can you say more about what testing from interviews looks like?
Sure. I mean, I think the most basic thing is like, if you have a data set, if you have an analysis that describes a person, always go to that person unless it's really sensitive and you can't wait. You have to wait until like later in the story. But like, if you have a data set or an analysis that describes that person, try to find that person and just on a really basic level, run back the facts about that person that is in the data. It could be, hey, like I'm a housing and real estate reporter by background. I do a lot of property record stuff. Like, do you own this? I've got a data set that says you own this. Is that true? And they might say like, no, I sold that 6 months ago. What are you talking about? Those are kind of like data quality vetting type things. In terms of actually testing the hypothesis, that is something that you would want to, like, I would say that there are kind of two sides of this. There's data quality vetting, where you basically take individual data points and records and you take them to the people who are touched by that data, and you just try to confirm the accuracy of it. And then there's this sort of hypothesis testing thing where you go to more trusted and maybe more knowledgeable sources, people who could be experts, people who just like know the field pretty well. And you say like, hey, like one, do you know this data set? Like, have you ever used this before? Two, like, do you have any problems with it? Three, I used it to do this. Have you ever heard of anything like this before? And you're just on like a gut level. And they might just say like, no, I've never heard of that before. That could be a sign that you're onto something really cool and new. It could be a sign that like you screwed something up. So those are how I would do it basically.
Cool. And we had a question from the live chat. This is, I guess, sort of similar. I think it was posted around the same time that you were talking about these kind of two different approaches. But they asked, is this kind of like inductive versus deductive reporting?
I can never keep straight which is which. I'm very sorry. Which is the one where you're like, you know something and you're using it to make an assumption about something else? I don't know. I'm going to look this up.
I want to say inductive is like intuition. So, but I could be wrong.
Need help from the audience.
Phone a friend. Deductive reasoning is the process of reasoning from one or more statements to reach a logically certain conclusion. Okay, inductive reasoning. I'm so sorry. Okay.
No, this is great. I'm sure this is educational for many.
Inductive reasoning is a method of reasoning in which the premises are viewed as supplying some evidence, but not full assurance for the truth of the conclusion. Okay. Okay. So I have no idea if this is the best way to think about it, but what this is making me think of is that there's data journalism that is informed by trying to basically be like a social scientist. Like you're really trying to be very rigorous. You're really trying to like imply like the scientific method. You just happen to be doing it outside the academy. And that is like the really intense kind of stuff. This story was not an example of that. This story was using data science methods to effectively find stories and anecdotes, find more examples of something happening, and to measure something that we had a sense of what was going on. I don't know if that gets to the inductive deductive thing, but like I basically think that data reporting comes in those two flavors, where either you are, again, you're really trying to do almost like a study, and then in the other sense, you're using tools like computer programming and statistics and that sort of thing to just like find stories and put stories in a little bit better context and understand them better. And doesn't have to be so like airtight.
That's good. There's a couple of comments in the chat. Someone said, the question asker, James, says, deductive is like Sherlock. And then another person responded, deductive is what Sherlock is supposed to be doing.
Okay, got it. When he's not, getting high off his pipe or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. You want to do the next one, Ryan?
So can you share some of your go-to data cleaning tools?
Oh, I really love CSV Kit. I don't know if anyone ever has used that, but it's just a great command line tool for trimming and sorting. And it's really good for like, if you have like just a gigantic file that even just like, I'm bad at SQL. I'm bad at SQL. I'm bad at building databases. I'm like a Python person. And so I will often just like load in a 500 megabyte file and just like wait the 3 minutes for it to do that, and just like will not like worry about that and do that over and over again. So CSV Kit is good for me because it means that it's basically this tool where you can run queries for like filtering and slicing CSV files very quickly. I think it's like compiled in C. I think it's just really fast. So that if you have like a really big file, you could just like run a query on it, spit it out as a separate file, and and then you've got that tiny file that you can load over and over again. So that's a great tool. So I'm a Python programmer. The Python libraries that I like to use are, let's see. I think in this case, when I was parsing addresses, there's something called US address that I think the DataMade people here in Chicago developed. That's a very useful tool. Yeah, just like super useful. This isn't like a library, it's more of like a methodology that I've adopted from like natural language processing, but like just like stop words, tokenization and stop words is super useful. Like if you're trying to like glob together duplicates of things or that kind of thing. Basically, it's the process of taking something like, you know, seniors are dying in CHA buildings and just like dropping out all of the, that was a really bad example, but anyway, you're dropping out like words that are very common and like trying to merge things that are more significant. Tools for deduplication. I haven't found, I keep wanting to use dedupe for things, and I keep like not being able to really get it to work for me. I don't know why. I think just maybe like the data that I have just doesn't fit it very well, but a lot of those like commercial tools I haven't used very often. So.
Cool. How long did your investigation take? Did you have a time limit or other kind of resource limit in your investigation?
I mean, you know, definitely time. I mean, this was in the beginning of the pandemic, and so everything just felt like go, 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 like the world is exploding. I would say that in terms of how long this took, I'm just looking up like the email that I got when I started working on this. I think it was probably like 2 months. No, that's crazy. I think it was maybe like, it was published in June. I think it was like a month. I think it was a month-long project from when I signed on to when we finally published it. Most of the really intense data work was front-ended. The data cleaning, the merging of the addresses, the doing the analysis. That was probably like a week or two of really dedicated like coding. Everything else was kind of like returning to that initial setup and tweaking it.
So what information do you wish the city would open up most?
It's a really good question. If I had anything,
It's your one chance.
yeah, exactly. God, now I'm just getting like indecisive. Oh well, okay. This isn't a city thing, but you know, as a housing reporter, I always want more housing data out there, and you know, we just don't have data on apartments in this county. Like we just don't. It's not out there. I mean, we do, but it's not really easy to get at. We don't know how many units are in every building in the county. We just don't have that. Which is very upsetting. We have kind of like general property classification type stuff. You know, this is a 2 flat, this is a 3 flat, this is a 4 flat. But beyond that, it's like, this is a California style apartment house. This is a courtyard apartment house. This is a big building, you know, and it's kind of like, oh my God, like, please just tell me how many units are in that building. And that is not something that exists. I think the people who are currently at the assessor are super progressive, super data savvy. I'm sure they're working on something very cool about that. And this is all a legacy of the previous administration, but that would be a data point that I would love to see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of that data is owned by commercial or private owners, like the MLS has like basically everything you just described, but they charge for that data, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. Well, we got another question. I think if folks have more to add to the chat, please do. I think we have one more question asked. It's actually two questions kind of in one. Sort of referring back to when you were sourcing the data and then picking which of those reports to pay $50 for.
Mm-hmm.
How did you know which people to pick? And as a follow-up question, does this fall under predictive statistics and predictive data, PII, which is personal information?
Yeah, I mean, so picking it was very much like kind of guesswork. So another body of records that we had in here that was helping us as a guide was internal emails at the CHA related to the pandemic that Mick had FOIA'd as well. And so in these emails, they made references to certain specific buildings. You know, they said like, what's going on at blah, blah, blah. And, you know, so that would be something where it's like, okay, we know that we have records about something going on at this building. So why don't we, frankly, just like pick the first and the last case at that building and just like ask for those. I would say that that was like the first pass. It very much was like a lot of guesswork, and it was also, we'd done a little bit of like basic statistics on, once we had merged the cases with the addresses, we did some basic statistics on the number of people who were dying at every building, and so we picked the buildings with the most cases, and if there was a building, if there was a building that had like the most, we wanted to make sure that we got like one or two of those, that we tried to look at that paperwork and figure out what was going on there. Definitely what you're describing in terms of like, I actually don't know that term. I don't know what I don't know what PII is, but from what it sounds like, yeah, I mean, it was an attempt to predict what someone, I mean, like, it's like, does Haru want to buy a sweater today? Like, like it was based on age and that kind of thing. Like it very much was that kind of thing, using some of these other things that we were able to correlate.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I think that sounds like that's what they were asking. Cool. Well, checking back to the live chat, I think that's it. We're out of questions and we're actually out of time. So this worked out well. Well, thanks again for presenting. This was super interesting. I know it's been a morbid topic, but you did a very good job like making it exciting and interesting. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thank you for having me.
What else do we have to do, Ryan?
I mean, I think there's only one thing left to do.
Wait, before we do it though, just to remind people, there's the post live stream thing, right?
So the post live stream Zoom. So as we mentioned before, you can still stick around with us and go through some announcements, but also have some chance to actually talk to each other and interact and see some smiling faces. So just follow this link. It's also going to be in the Shahacknight Remote Slack channel as well. And we'll see you shortly.
All right, awesome. And I think, yeah, that leaves just the last thing. So thanks again, everybody, and go forth and
hack.
All right.